Welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker. Vinton, I look forward to our partnership.
Our partnership?
As your co-host.
You hear this guy? Man openly campaigns against. Wait,
I didn't.
You didn't.
I didn't campaign against you.
That didn't happen.
I thought we could run on the same ticket, actually.
Oh, okay, yeah. We're co-hosts.
Yeah, let's do that.
There's no hierarchy in co-hosting.
So as you've figured out already, this episode is dedicated to the election of 1800. After a number of emotional episodes, we're finally getting back to politics.
About time.
And in this episode, we're going to cover how, at the beginning of our American story, we didn't have elections the same way we do today. The entire election cycle, where we vote for a president and a vice president together on one ticket, originated because of the events in this song.
That's right. The election of 1800, sometimes known as the Revolution of 1800.
Right, because it's the first peaceful transition of powers from one party in control of the United States to another party in control.
Right, not what you would expect from a revolution.
Right, and it probably seemed a lot more revolutionary for the people at the time because we're used to seeing a peaceful transition of powers from the Democrats to the Republicans, from Bill Clinton to George Bush to Obama, where you have different regimes taking control, so to speak, different administrations, we call them, and you see that transition of power from one party to another is normal. It's a part of our lives. We're used to this. They hadn't seen that yet.
That's right. Not necessarily always quote-unquote peaceful, but definitely bloodless.
Yeah, and so this situation is the first time you see that we've had Federalists in charge. We saw 2 presidencies of George Washington, then he stepped down. Then we saw the presidency of John Adams, which had this little tinge of contention because his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, was the leader of his opposing party.
That's right. And in the election of 1800, you're going to have the Federalists coming up against the Democratic Republicans because John Adams is trying to keep his seat as president. And each side is picking 2 candidates. For the Federalists, you have John Adams and Charles C. Pinckney. And for the Democratic Republicans, you have Jefferson and Burr.
Right. So the way that this election process worked, you had for every single state, you received the number of electors as your congressional representatives plus your senators. And so that was the number of electors you got to send to vote for your president. So the state would select these electors, and then they would choose on your behalf who they wanted to vote for president because they think that people are stupid and we want to protect the government from the stupid people. At least that was one of the theories involved in how our government was created. But in that process, every single elector was given 2 votes, and those votes were equal with one another.
That's right. They would cast 2 votes, and one they would cast for the president. The second one they would cast for the vice president.
Right, but because there was no distinction between their vote for president and their vote for vice president, there was always the chance that the person you wanted as vice president might accidentally overtake the president.
Exactly.
That was a concern that Alexander Hamilton had in one of the races when George Washington was elected unanimously, so to speak, but he was worried that because of the way the system was built, that John Adams might accidentally overtake George Washington in votes. So he schemed to get some votes taken away from John Adams to get some of the electors to throw their vote towards another person so that John Adams wouldn't accidentally become the president.
That's right. And they even did this in this election. In this election, they voted for, of course, John Adams and Charles Pinckney in the Federalist side. And then they had one person who voted for John Jay.
Yes. And so that was the idea that now parties were a thing. Before, at the beginning of our Constitution being drafted, they had the idea that the electors would just vote for the best representatives, period. Now political parties exist. And so you're only going to vote for the people that are a part of your party. And these political strategists understood that if you want to make sure you don't accidentally put the wrong person in the presidency, all of the Federalists will get together and cast their first vote for the president seat of John Adams. And then you'd have all of your Federalist electors cast their second vote for Charles Pinckney, except for one. And you'd have one person throw their vote behind someone else. And so that's what the Federalists did. They did it correctly. They had 65 votes for John Adams and 64 votes for Charles Pinckney. The problem is the Republicans messed it up.
They did. They end up with a tie for Jefferson and Burr, 73-73.
Yeah, the person who is supposed to throw their vote towards someone else forgot to do that. How do you do that? How do you go in, cast your vote, and forget that, oh yeah, I was supposed to throw it to this person, not the other? And so when Burr and Jefferson tied, you have the first situation in American history when the election is no longer being decided just directly by those electors, because you don't have a first and a second place. You have two people who tied for first. It now goes, if you remember your American history or your civics government class, it goes to the House of Representatives to elect the president, which wouldn't have been that much of a problem since the Republicans had just won a lot of seats in the Congress, except that it was the outgoing Congress that got to choose and vote for the presidency.
That's right.
And so John Adams's Federalist-led Congress was now in charge of selecting between these two Republican representatives. And so now, if the Republicans were in charge, they would have been able to just say, okay, we wanted Thomas Jefferson in control, we're just going to give it to him now. But the Federalists decided to do a little more scheming. They thought, we really hate this Thomas Jefferson guy. Maybe Aaron Burr would be more of a moderate, and we can control him. So a lot of the Federalists were willing to cast their votes in support of Aaron Burr because they wanted to thwart a Thomas Jefferson presidency.
Exactly. And in our song here, and what we're going to be focusing on talking about, these Federalists look towards Hamilton to make this decision.
Historians will go back and forth debating whether it was the congressmen looking for Hamilton's input and requesting that, or whether it was Hamilton being so invested in Burr's downfall that he just stuck his nose in it, whether they wanted his opinion or not. But he was invested in this, and he started writing pamphlets and circulating letters to the Federalists in Congress saying, this is why you should not support Aaron Burr.
Now, our song here picks a definite side on that historical question, which leads us right into the lyrics.
Yes.
So that sets it up. Let's go in.
Yes.
The election of 1800. We have Jefferson and Madison taking center stage here. Jefferson saying, can we get back to politics? Which is what we've all been thinking.
Right. We've seen the wrap up of the conflict with Hamilton's home life, and now we're about to get back to the political struggles, and we see that his lesser antagonists of Jefferson and Madison, their team up of Democratic Republicans who are against him, come on stage, and they're now going to control the narrative, driving it back toward politics and the political struggle that's going on.
And I like that Madison says that begging, please, because on the staging here, he has a handkerchief with him and he comes out looking kind of sad and he starts wiping his eyes because the last song made him cry. And he was like, this is too much for me too, guys.
Yeah, I appreciate that he's the audience surrogate there, that
right.
We're all in the audience crying, bawling our eyes out. We don't know how we'll move on. And it's several lines into the singing before James Madison is able to have dry eyes again, because he's taking the handkerchief and he's wiping his eyes, and his voice squeaks somewhat as he goes through and tries to gain his composure again.
And Jefferson goes into quoting one of his favorites, Newton, the third law of motion, just like he did in Washington on your side. Every action has an equal opposite reaction. And we've mentioned before that that was a favorite of Jefferson. A little story that I picked up on when I was looking into some research for this, I didn't pick up on the first time we talked about that, was that he had 3 paintings hanging in his house. One of John Locke, one of Francis Bacon, and one of Isaac Newton. And he called that, quote, Trinity of the 3 greatest men the world had ever produced. And there's a story that Hamilton at one point came over to his house and he showed them the Trinity and was bragging about them. And then Hamilton dramatically paused before replying, the greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar. And Jefferson felt scandalized by this.
Right.
Today, some scholars believe that Hamilton was just trolling Jefferson, and I love that idea because it seems so Hamilton to me to just say something just to make Jefferson angry.
Yeah, and other scholars will also point out that this is coming from Thomas Jefferson's pen, and it's in those journal writings that he had given. That account is not given by anyone else other than Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
So just like we had in the narrative of In the Room Where It Happens, where no one else was there in that room, we only have Thomas Jefferson's voice. So Thomas claims that Hamilton was talking about Julius Caesar as the greatest person who ever lived. But Thomas Jefferson is also invested in the American people seeing Hamilton in a bad light. So he's obviously going to paint Alexander Hamilton as liking this Caesar-esque emperor role. But whether that little anecdote is completely factual, completely historical, or whether it's just a nice little side note in our history textbooks, we do know 100% that Thomas Jefferson loved him some science.
That's right. So this next line, John Adams, the bed, much like Charles Lee earlier in our musical.
Right.
But Jefferson says he loves Adams, which historically we've had this discussion, but They were friends. They had a falling out, and they do kind of come back together as friends toward the ends of their lives.
Yeah, during the John Adams presidency, Thomas Jefferson actively leading the opposition party, often using insider information that he got as vice president to take down the Adams administration and to attack the Adams administration in the press. There were very few points of friendship during that presidency and during this election, but they were friends originally when they were both ambassadors, and then they became friends again later in their lives. Go listen to our John Adams episode if you're interested in more of that relationship, because it is very well done in the HBO miniseries, and we get into a little bit of the details there historically about their interactions. Jefferson and John Adams had a fascinating relationship.
Poor Alexander Hamilton, he's missing in action. Now, you'll remember in our musical, there's a bit of a time switch here. In the song, they're talking about he's missing in action because of grieving over his son, his marriage falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
In history, this is before his son had died. The reason he's missing in action during this election is because he's serving in the military right now. He's leading an army.
That's right. Remember that under John Adams, we saw George Washington come back as the general of this new standing army that John Adams had established, and Alexander Hamilton was the de facto leader of said army. So even though Alexander Hamilton had resigned from Washington's staff, he never really left the political spotlight. There were always people who were looking to him as the figurehead of the Federalist Party, the one that if John Adams was not able to continue the Federalist legacy, they still thought that maybe Hamilton would take it up, would take up the mantle, and would run ahead, waving the Federalist banner above his head. But much to their disappointment, John Adams becomes the final Federalist president.
Right. Jefferson brings up here that he's facing Burr. And Madison says he's very attractive in the North. New Yorkers like his chances. And Jefferson says he's not very forthcoming on any particular stances. That's a little bit of that talk less. Madison says, ask him a question, it glances off. He obfuscates, he dances.
I love that they work obfuscates into a rap song. It's well done.
Yeah, right?
When it comes to Aaron Burr's reputation historically, he's always seen as someone who has a charismatic presence. He controls any room that he walks into because of his demeanor, his politeness, his willingness to work any room and to get people on his side. He was the type of person that had friends, ongoing friends, in the Federalist camp and friends in the Republican camp. And so because he was willing to keep those friendships going at a time when political rivalries were deepening and deepening and deepening, it meant that very few sides trusted him completely. Lots of people saw him as a sly, little shady person that they couldn't really know exactly where he stood. Are you a Federalist? Are you a Republican? Who do you really support? And if you're a Republican, then denounce all of your Federalist friends. And he was just willing to be that politician that was actively seeking office without destroying all of his political enemies. He thought that his way up would be to network with all of those different areas and work every room.
That's exactly right. In history, unlike our musical, Burr did have stances and he did have political opinions.
Quite
he was
a few.
An abolitionist. He was a supporter of racial and gender equality, a promoter of education.
He had Mary Wollstonecraft above his mantle.
That's right. The difference lies between him and Hamilton and Jefferson, that neither Jefferson nor Hamilton would be willing to opportunistically switch parties. Burr didn't have investments in the ideologies of a certain party. He had his own beliefs, and he was willing to do what it took to succeed and go up in power.
Right. And it doesn't make a lot of sense in our own political climate for someone to say, well, I'm kind of this party, I'm kind of that, I kind of stand for this party or this issue, and they're trying to be their own, a party unto themselves. But at that point in time, since the political parties were still in their genesis, a lot of them were nothing more than personality cults. And Aaron Burr is nobody if he is not his own man. And he refused to bow down to people like Alexander Hamilton, who he saw as characteristically unfit when it comes to the temperament of a political leader. He thought that he had an unfit temperament, which is, interestingly enough, one of the phrases we're seeing fly around for one of our other political candidates in our presidency today, but that's neither here nor there. Aaron Burr thought that Hamilton was unfit politically because of his own temperament and his aggression and his inability to let attacks fly off of him. He thought that Thomas Jefferson was weak in his stances. He thought he was a terrible governor, and he thought that he wouldn't stand up and fight for his land, and so he had a lot of trouble respecting Thomas Jefferson. And he had issues even with George Washington, who he saw as someone he didn't want to bow down to across the board. And so he was standing up for himself. He was standing up for the things he believed in, but he was refusing to bow down to these personality cults, saying, I'm just going to be a part of this Hamilton cult or this Jefferson cult. He said, I'm going to stand for the issues that I want. But in this musical, he is a much different person because we see here Aaron Burr through the lens of Alexander Hamilton's perspective. This is the Aaron Burr that Hamilton always believed in, that he always talked about. The one who doesn't care about intellectual integrity, which was an attack that Aaron Burr actually leveled against Thomas Jefferson. He said he was an intellectual hypocrite at times. That was after the presidency and they were fighting with each other a lot. But Aaron Burr in this musical will just switch parties because he's an opportunist. He'll switch parties because he sees an opportunity and he'll grab it. And it doesn't matter to him what principles he's violating in the process.
Jefferson says, and they say that I'm a Francophile. At least they know I know where France is.
I like that a lot.
Which people did view him that way. Like we mentioned before, he did love France. The line about him knowing where France is, there's nothing really behind that I could find. It's not like Burr didn't know, except the only thing I could find really is that's a general thing for American politicians to be bad at geography when it comes to political issues.
I appreciate that Madison's response there is exactly what it would have been historically and in the musical, where he says that's a problem. They see Burr as a less extreme you. Right. They see Burr as the guy who, yes, he'll fight for Republican values and he'll fight for the state rights and he will fight to do the things that the Democratic Republicans typically wanted to do. But Aaron Burr hadn't taken such a definitive stance in favor of the French Revolution that became really bloody and unpopular by this time. The thing that Thomas Jefferson had a really hard time distancing himself from because of all the support he had thrown behind it from the beginning. So Aaron Burr, less associated with the French Revolution, and yet still as attractive to the Republican cause.
So Madison suggests a change of course, a key endorsement that might redeem Jefferson. And when Jefferson asks who he has in mind, he says, don't laugh. You used to work on the same staff.
I love that we get to see those characteristics. Daveed Diggs' responses when he's like, what?
Right. Jefferson constantly surprised again.
Yeah. He even kind of prepared himself there. He said, who is it? And you see that he has that moment to prepare, and Madison has been prepping him for it. And Jefferson is still shocked that Madison would even suggest this. And I think it's a few lines later before Jefferson realizes that Madison is being serious.
Right.
When he first joins in and he's singing, it might be nice to get Hamilton on your side. It doesn't feel to me like Jefferson is taking it seriously. He's like, oh yeah, that's funny. That's a funny little joke, Madison. Nice try, James. And then as they finish singing those stanzas, I can imagine Daveed Diggs' face just realizing, oh, you're serious about this. You actually think Hamilton would support me? What in our history suggests that to you?
Yeah, like you said, though, Madison brings it up and he says it in that sing-songy way. It must be nice. Just like they said about Washington, it must be nice to have Washington on your side. But here he's saying it might be nice to get Hamilton on your side. And like you mentioned, I do like the way Jefferson, his face in the staging there is like, what? What are you talking about? And he joins in the second time, kind of jokingly. And as they come to the end, I'm like, wait, you're serious? I don't understand. And at that point, they bring in Burr on the stage. Jefferson and Madison make their way off the side. And Burr comes in with his talk less, smile more, and the ensemble's just yelling for him, Burr, Burr.
Feel the Burr.
You can tell where the people are going with their votes right at this moment. And this is the first time you really hear him with that talk less, smile more in a super enthusiastic, joyful way. He's really into it here.
Yeah, he's emphasizing that smile there. He's using that charismatic approach to his campaign styles. Historically, it was not seen as a very appropriate thing for anyone to campaign for the presidency. People thought that in order to be fit for the presidency, you needed to be a humble person. You needed to be someone on whom this power was simply thrust. And so they saw people as George Washington, who were saying, I will serve my country if it's chosen of me. And John Adams, who didn't openly campaign because he thought, if I'm asking for votes, I mean, that's beneath me. And I would never lower myself as to ask people to vote for me. And then here, Aaron Burr in our musical is acting like a modern day politician, actively going out there, kissing babies. He is running up and down the stage and is seeking out those votes. He's going door to door, openly campaigning.
Yeah, you could consider him the father of modern day political campaigning. He's a people person. He's going out there and pleasing the people. He's going to the parties. He's making his presence known.
I appreciate that one of the books I was reading just this week is called American Emperor. It's a biography of Aaron Burr written by David O. Stewart. And toward the beginning of this biography, he talks about the charismatic approach and appeal of Aaron Burr in the way that his eyes are commented on by nearly every single person who ever wrote about Aaron Burr. He says that there were people on every side of the aisle that always talked about how he had captivating eyes. One writer called them basilisk eyes, that you can't look away from them. You're just stone. You're staring into his eyes. Men, women alike, people were just fixated on how colorful and powerful his eyes were, to the point that there was someone during Aaron Burr's tour of the Western states that saw him, had never seen him before. He looked at him into his eyes and said, "You must be Vice President Aaron Burr, because I've heard so much about the eyes of our vice president." And he just looked at him and thought that that was an interesting characteristic. And so you see here that Aaron Burr is leveraging all of his physical prowess, all of his polite actions and his attitudes, and he's going out there as the charismatic crowd pleaser. He's the people pleaser, going out there raising votes with his charisma.
That's right. For 2 months, he worked really hard. He established a campaign headquarters, and he created a list of every New York City voter with detailed descriptions of their political leanings, financial status, and temperament. He organized supporters, and they went electioneering door to door. It was the 1800s, basically, of that get out the vote initiative.
Right. This is the thing that modern politicians love to do through smartphones and Google devices and different things, where they try to track your voting habits and track your purchasing habits to figure out what marketing will appeal to you as a voter. It's kind of scary how much data exists on us today in the internet age. But there, Aaron Burr and his staff had to do it by hand, go out there and create this grassroots movement of people trying to get out the vote. One of the reasons that the Southern Republicans wanted to get Aaron Burr onto their ticket for the vice president slot to begin with was because they knew that in order to win the election, they knew that Thomas Jefferson could win all of the Republican voters. He was the leader of their party. They knew that. But they knew that in order to give them that last little bump, they needed someone who had connections in the North. They needed someone who could carry a state like New York. New York had enough electors to put Thomas Jefferson into the lead slot if the Republicans in the North were willing to support a Jefferson-Burr ticket, where they were running together saying Jefferson would get the most votes, but then Burr would get to be his vice president. And so people from the Democratic Republican Party had gone to Burr asking him to be the vice presidential candidate, and he didn't want to do it initially, but once he got in, he was pedal to the metal, campaigning, doing everything he could. One of the reasons he was hesitant to do it at first is because he kind of had the idea that he had the New York governor's seat in the bag if he just waited around long enough. And so he didn't want to trade the certainty of a governor's seat with the possibility of a vice presidential race. But here in our musical, we see that he is the kind of guy who is going to get out there and he will not halfway do something. He will do everything he can to appeal to voters. And I love the way we get to see the ensemble respect Aaron Burr and reflect the attitude of different voters for him.
Now, the South had another advantage as well when it came to the voting, and it was that due to the 3/5 clause, slaves could be counted in voting. So due to this, a lot of historians say that this is the reason that Jefferson would win.
Because Virginia had that large contingency of people that they could count as 3/5 of a person.
Right. And there's this quote where Jefferson's criticized, saying that he would ride into the Temple of Liberty on the shoulders of slaves. Now, speaking of people that can and can't vote, women could not vote at this time. And Burr brings us up here in our lyrics, saying, it's 1800, ladies. Tell your husbands, vote Burr. Which Burr himself was a proponent in women's rights, like we've said before. He even submitted a bill to allow women to vote at some point, but it obviously didn't go through. Mm-hmm. Women were not granted the right to vote until August 20th, 1920, when the 19th Amendment would be passed. And even then, there was a racial divide in voting.
Right. Ridiculous.
Because while black women could vote, technically, there were these tests put in place to keep them disenfranchised.
Yeah, American history has a long-standing tradition of suppressing minority voters and finding ways to do that in really creative and logically justifiable ways, arguably, where they try to suppress other types of voters who wouldn't necessarily be in favor, statistically speaking, of the privileged group or the powerful group of the powerful Democratic Republicans in Virginia, so to speak.
And a small side note here as well about people that can't vote, that I find very interesting. Native Americans themselves couldn't even vote until 1947. But continuing on with our lyrics, I like this male voter who jumps in here. I don't like Adams. There's a woman that comes in. Well, he's going to lose. That's just defeatist. Which, popular opinion today amongst certain people running for different offices, there's always that person that's running that says, well, that's a wasted vote. They're going to lose. Mm-hmm. Don't waste your vote on that person.
And then these other voters come forward and they talk about Jefferson's Francophile tendencies when he says, in Jefferson, in love with France, yeah, he's so elitist. That's the female response to the male ensemble saying that he's in love with France, that he is a part of that aristocracy who's above everybody else. He's that French aristocracy, that French Enlightenment thinker who thinks he's so much smarter than everyone else, and that's why he quotes people like Sir Isaac Newton all of the time every time he comes on stage, and these people are looking at that saying, he's standing up for the people, he's the people's candidate, yet he's so much higher than us, like an elite person. So they see Burr as the less extreme version of that elitist, and I appreciate that the response towards Burr is much more affectionate.
Right. It kind of reminds me of politics today when you discuss certain politicians. Some of them are, they're not relatable to the people. They're up there in their castle. But this guy, he hangs out with us. Like this woman says, I can't believe we're here with him. And this man, he seems approachable. Like you could grab a beer with him.
There's the notion in the American psychology, and I think this is just human psychology, that the more approachable someone is, the more you're willing to trust them. And whether you can grab a beer with someone doesn't mean that they'll be the kind of person that is able to make good political decisions. It's not necessarily the best way to choose your political candidates as to whether you can get drunk with them or not. It's just that that's something that lets people like you more. If you're approachable, if you're someone that seems down to earth, then you will have people on your side because you're leveraging that charisma, that approachability, and that's something that Aaron Burr is able to do. He was the party person. He would show up at parties, no matter the political party, he would show up at the person's dinner party, and he would be working the room, and he would grab beers with people.
And so at this point, the ensemble, or the voters, want to know how Hamilton's going to be voting. The Federalists here. Dear Mr. Hamilton, your fellow Federalists would like to know how you'll be voting, and Hamilton just says, it's quiet uptown. His mind is still stuck in the previous song. He doesn't care about this election. He is focused on his family, and that's where his mind is.
In the last song, It's Quiet Uptown, the ensemble was giving Alexander Hamilton its distance. They said, you see him walking in the street, talking to himself, have pity on him. Now, in the middle of this political turmoil and the drama happening on stage, you see Alexander Hamilton's trying to just walk the length of the city. He's trying to be in this quiet space, and the ensemble is no longer having pity on him. They are crowding him. They literally surround him, and Alexander Hamilton is trying to regain that quiet, and the people are saying, Alexander Hamilton, hey, Mr. Hamilton, we want to know how you're going to be voting. Yeah. Tell us this thing. And they're not giving him space anymore. They're now consumed with an interest in what's Hamilton going to say about this election.
To even show that, they cut him off before he can even finish saying it's quiet uptown, and they say, "Dear Mr. Hamilton, John Adams doesn't stand a chance, so who are you promoting?" And Hamilton again wants no part of it. It's quiet uptown. And the ensemble splits here, men and women, going back and forth, Jefferson or Burr. We know it's lose-lose, kind of like today in politics. You often hear the term voting for the lesser evil. There's no winning in this situation. Which one are you going to pick?
I like how the ensemble just lets the chaos build, and they start singing in a round, they start echoing one another, and they get louder and louder, and they keep repeating those phrases, Jefferson or Burr, Jefferson or Burr, John Adams doesn't stand a chance, so who are you promoting? If you had to choose, and they keep singing these lines over and over again, on top of each other, layer upon layer, it's like this political turmoil. And as the music is raising and getting louder and louder, and everyone's really excited to see how Hamilton's going to respond, the music drops out for a moment, the ensemble drops out, and we get to hear just a personal conversation between Aaron Burr, the politician, and Alexander Hamilton, the homebody.
I almost like to believe here that Hamilton is answering the question of who are you going to choose when he says, if it isn't Aaron Burr. He's like, well, I'll pick anyone if it isn't Aaron Burr.
Oh, wow. That's actually well-used use of that double entendre there. Well-positioned use of that.
But you get to see that motif return, that Aaron Burr, sir. Alexander, you've created quite a stir, sir.
I appreciate how Lin-Manuel Miranda delivers these lines with a much more measured and slow response than Aaron Burr has.
Yeah.
So he says, well, if it isn't Aaron Burr, sir, Alexander, you've created quite a stir, sir. I'm going door to door. You're openly campaigning. Sure. It's like the tables are completely flipped here. The
That's
person
right.
who speaks more slowly is the guy at the beginning who wished for a war. The guy that is aggressively going after what he wants and is not throwing away a shot is Aaron Burr. And so while we saw their rise and fall mirroring each other throughout this musical, this is one of the moments where it really comes into the musical as a major theme, and you see this directly played out against one another with the two attitudes and the way they deliver their lines.
Burr tells Hamilton that he's campaigning, and Hamilton says, well, that's new. And Burr says, honestly, it's kind of draining. And you see him almost like gritting his teeth, talking through a smile like, yeah, holding this smile all day is getting hard.
Leslie Odom Jr. has a great smile, though.
He does.
It's such an attractive, just charismatic, contagious smile. That's what it is. When he's smiling, everyone in the room is smiling.
And it's interesting that Burr brings back this respect to Alexander. We talked previously about how he had lost it and he wasn't using sir anymore and he wasn't calling him Hamilton. He was losing this respect. Here he's calling him sir. He's campaigning to Alexander. He's wanting to show him respect and kindness.
Hamilton here has a confrontation in the next few lines with Burr that is very striking when you put it in the context of their very first conversation, where at the beginning of this musical, one of the first confrontations they ever have, in fact, the very first confrontation they have is when Alexander Hamilton looks at Burr and says, if you stand for nothing, Burr, what will you fall for? Here, Aaron Burr's standing for something. He is fighting for something, and he's the one that's refusing to throw away his shot, and Aaron Burr confesses that. He says, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm chasing what I want. And you know what? I learned that from you.
Yeah, that line's really impactful, actually, when he says, I learned it from you.
And it's appropriate that Alexander Hamilton has no more lines in conversation with Burr there, because it is kind of that mic drop moment that there's nothing you can say in response to that because it's true.
Yeah. So in our musical here, the votes have been cast. The ensemble's repeating that if you had to choose, and then Madison announces it's a tie. Like we've mentioned before, it was 73-73, and someone did not vote properly the way it was all, quote unquote, planned to go. They were supposed to throw away that one vote so we would have the president and the vice president. It's not the way it went down.
Right. So you have this tie, and they say in the musical it's up to the delegates if you had to choose, and then they say it's up to Hamilton.
Because you have the Federalists making that vote, and they're looking towards Hamilton as their leader. It's really interesting to think of that throughout this musical, Hamilton has been rising and rising, and there's this idea that he could become president. He's heading that way, but then everything falls out from under him, and all of a sudden it's Jefferson or Burr instead, and Hamilton has to pick between the two people that are pretty opposite of him, because he's lost his place in that race. And yet the delegates are still like, Hamilton, you're the one that's going to pick because we're looking to you to lead.
In history, Alexander Hamilton didn't necessarily believe that his political ambitions were at an end. He didn't necessarily believe that he was never ever going to have the opportunity of pursuing a higher office again. So a lot of historians will lean into that fact, saying that the reason he picked up his pen and wrote against Aaron Burr every single time is because he saw Aaron Burr winning Federalist support, and he saw Aaron Burr as a New Yorker in his own state winning potential votes away from people who would have been voting for Alexander Hamilton. And so this is Alexander Hamilton looking at a fellow New Yorker who was currently garnishing Federalist votes who would have naturally gone for Hamilton, who are now flirting with the idea of voting for Burr, and he's just floored that his supporters would go to another New Yorker instead of him. So some historians lean into that, saying that the reason Hamilton opposes Burr is because it's a politician on his front porch that is able to steal his own supporters away from him. And so he goes into it with that political conniving idea, with that ambition of trying to tear down one of his closest enemies, because he sees that Thomas Jefferson's Republican from the South, and so his supporters will always support him, but he sees Burr as a more immediate threat. So there's that big question in history as to whether Hamilton opposed Burr for personal political reasons or for principle and conviction. And what we'll see in the next couple stanzas is that in our musical, we go with the Hamilton-friendly approach of saying that it's all about principles. What do you stand up for? What will you fight for? Aaron Burr fights for nothing but his own position, his own jockeying to be in the room where it happens. He has no principles of his own. He's willing to throw out all party loyalties, all personal loyalties, just for the sake of getting ahead himself. And so here Hamilton takes the microphone. He's no longer just living in his house in the quiet setting. He gets up there, and I like that he starts out with that, yo, as if he's introducing himself as the old Hamilton.
Right, just like he did in The Farmer Refuted. In our staging here, he's climbed up onto the second part of the stage, that second story, and the ensemble's dancing below, and they all look toward him as he says, yo, and they start yelling their O's, and this excitement, anticipation of what he's going to say. He says, the people are asking to hear my voice. For the country is facing a difficult choice, and if you were to ask me who I'd promote, Jefferson has my vote.
That's such a great line. I love the tension there, that in the musical, if you didn't know history, if you didn't know the story arcs that they're clearly hinting toward, you wouldn't necessarily know who it is that Alexander Hamilton is going to support. In the original line that Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote, the lyrics said, if you were to ask me who I'd prefer, don't vote Burr. And when Lin-Manuel Miranda was talking about this moment, he said, I want the tension to be larger. I want them to be on the edge of their seats, some people in the audience wondering, who is he going to support? Who's he going to choose? Who's he going to choose? Because he wants us to feel that excitement and that tension that the ensemble feels, wondering who he's going to support. And if you say the word prefer, and he says, don't vote, then obviously everyone in the audience knows Burr. The guy that rhymes with prefer is the one you're discouraging us from voting for. And he said, I'm just going to change the words so that I'm not picking a word that rhymes with Jefferson. I'm not picking a word that rhymes with Burr. I'm going to make it to where I say promote and rhyme that with vote. And he says, Jefferson has my vote.
And when he says that, Jefferson and Madison have this surprised look on the staging and they join the ensemble and they're just so excited.
And Aaron Burr is up front and he has his own reaction and he is equally surprised, but his smile stays, and you see it's like his smile is the last thing that fades from his face as his eyes get downcast and he's just shocked. This is the et tu, Brute moment where Aaron Burr is looking up at Hamilton, his first friend, his enemy, and he feels backstabbed. He has been talking to this guy from the very beginning. He was his first friend in this musical. Granted, he wasn't the friend that was there with him fighting along by his side with the trio of Marquis de Lafayette, Hercules Mulligan, and John Lawrence, but he was there. He was the first person that Hamilton idolized, was Aaron Burr there in this musical, and Aaron Burr is completely betrayed, and it can't be more different. The response that Aaron Burr has versus the response that Madison and Thomas Jefferson have in this staging, where you remember that there was a moment in the second act when Jefferson, Madison, and Burr were all three together. and they were the team that confronted Hamilton as the Republican trio. Here, Burr is the one that's alone, where his friends are betrayed him.
Yeah, I've never made that contrast before, where the two have switched, and Hamilton is now on their side against Burr, and he's the one on the outside of the trio. Now, of course, they're not a full-on trio, and Hamilton goes on to explain why he did pick Jefferson. He says, I have never agreed with Jefferson once. We have fought on like 75 different fronts. But when all is said and all is done, Jefferson has beliefs, Burr has none. And there's actually a letter I'd like to read at least a small portion of from December 1800, where Hamilton wrote, my opinion is, after mature reflection, that if Jefferson and Burr come with equal votes to the House of Representatives to support Jefferson, the former ought be preferred by Federalists. Mr. Jefferson is yet a lover of liberty. Mr. Burr loves nothing but himself. In a choice of evils, let them take the least. Jefferson is, in my view, less dangerous than Burr.
It's fascinating that Alexander Hamilton would promote his political rival from the first Washington administration, the Thomas Jefferson guy who was opposing him in every single cabinet battle we've seen in this musical.
And the ensemble's just as surprised as everyone else, really, saying, well, I'll be damned. Well, I'll be damned. And Jefferson comes up with that, and wanting to know, what's the result now? What's the result? Madison says, you won in a landslide. The final count in the House was 10 votes for Jefferson, 4 votes for Burr, and 2 blank ballots.
But that wasn't an immediate response. They went through a number of tied votes in the House of Representatives before they finally had someone turn their vote around.
That's right.
And support that. And a lot of the people that analyze this will say that it was Hamilton's influence that turned those final ballots toward Thomas Jefferson instead of Aaron Burr, because he was writing letters condemning Aaron Burr's reputation and attacking him as the person that Federalists could not predict, could not support. I appreciate how the ensemble immediately recognizes how much of a burn this is to Aaron Burr, that we see Alexander Hamilton endorse Thomas Jefferson, and we've been on the edge of our seats waiting for that endorsement, and the ensemble just like immediately, ooh, and that's just an incredible moment where everyone has a response, whether you're shocked, whether you're appalled, whether you're excited, whether you're on the edge of your seat. You're excited in this moment to see what has happened. I never really thought that I would understand exactly what it's like to sit on the edge of your seat waiting for an endorsement speech. But then the Republican National Convention happened this year, and I watched both conventions very readily because I'm a political nerd, and I remember the moment that a lot of political wonks will agree with when we were sitting on the edge of our seats watching the Ted Cruz speech at the RNC, and we were waiting for the moment to see whether Ted Cruz would endorse their party's candidate, Donald Trump, after Trump had said a number of things about Ted Cruz, and they had a number of spites back and forth. And Ted Cruz didn't do it. And it was a huge reaction where there were boos, there were shouts, there were chants against him. The media was talking about it for days when it came to the response of someone's endorsement speech or their lack of endorsing someone. And so now, looking back at this, I have a little bit of a different response to this endorsement speech where Alexander Hamilton is choosing Thomas Jefferson here instead of Aaron Burr, because it actually happened that people were engrossed by whether someone is going to be endorsing someone else. It's interesting the way we look at certain celebrities, be them political or otherwise, and we really put a lot of weight into what they think politically.
So as Jefferson finds out the votes, Burr approaches him and says, congrats on a race well won. I did give you a fight. And he holds his hand out, humbly following his own instructions of talk less, smile more. I'm going to do this the right way.
Yeah. I appreciate that we see in this moment Aaron Burr's chivalry almost, that he's a good loser. He isn't the kind of guy in this moment who is going to just throw away all decency. He's going to do the polite thing of shaking hands after the show, after the fight. He's just gone head to head with this guy, but he lost, and he goes out to shake his hand.
And Burr says, I look forward to our partnership. And Jefferson's laughing in his face. He says, our partnership? Burr says, as your vice president. Yeah, right. Jefferson didn't trust Burr. Burr was once a loyal running mate and said if he was chosen as president when the House of Representatives voted, he would not turn it down.
Yeah, so there are two things in that right there. That Aaron Burr is often approached as a person who spoke out of both sides of his mouth frequently, that he would say one thing to one group, another thing to another group. So he was just unpredictable, and he was pandering to every audience he ever saw. He once, as a lawyer, said that things that are written remain. So he chose not to write things down very often because he didn't want to get boxed into a corner. He wanted to be able to wiggle out and be sly about it. So this is one of those moments that historians will look back on. And originally, when the Democratic Republicans got together and said, okay, we need a Northerner to help carry New York State, who can we look to? They looked to Governor Clinton first, and he turned it down. So they looked to Aaron Burr as one of their consolation prizes and said, we'll get him on the ticket. And Aaron Burr said originally, if we get into this electoral situation where I'm tied with Thomas Jefferson, in the unlikely event that I'm tied, I'm obviously going to negate my rights and I'm going to turn over the presidency to Thomas Jefferson. There's no way I'm going to oppose him. I'm not going to oppose him. And here he has the opportunity to step down and say, you know what? I know I tied. I don't want the presidency. I'm going to tell the Congress to select my opponent, not me, because I'm going to politely decline. But instead of politely declining, Aaron Burr lets the vote go on and on and on, and he does not decline. And he had that moment leading into this election where he said, which seems very different from what he said at the beginning, that instead of turning over my rights and resigning to Thomas Jefferson, the presidency, if I am selected as president through the fluke of the system, I'm not going to deny the American voice. I'm going to let them speak, and I will serve as my country needs me, which sounds to the Republicans like a flip-flop and like he is completely untrustworthy, because when he has the chance to support Jefferson in this election, he kind of sits back and watches to see whether he might get that top seat.
Which is why Jefferson says, you hear this guy? Man openly campaigns against me, talking about, I look forward to our partnership. And Madison reminds him, it is crazy that the guy who comes in second gets to be vice president.
Jefferson's response to Madison, I love the cockiness in it, where Aaron Burr's hand is still out there waiting to shake Jefferson's hand. He's still standing
pretty
there.
Much the end of this song, he's holding his hand out.
Yeah, but then Jefferson's completely ignoring it, talking to Madison, and he says, you know what? We can change that he's the vice president here. You know why? Because I'm the president. And so he goes into this defensive mode where he says, this is crazy that the vice president, the guy that comes in second, gets to be on my ticket, to work with me, even though he kind of worked against me here and he wasn't supportive. Now, up until this point, we've seen vice presidents and presidents that did not get along. John Adams was notoriously shunned from George Washington's decision-making meetings. John Adams historically did not work very well with his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson was actively leading the opposing party during the same time. Here, we're going to see the first term of the Jefferson presidency with Aaron Burr on the ticket as a vice president, and they never get along at all. But in 1803, Thomas Jefferson does follow through on this promise of saying, I'm going to change this process. And we get to see the 12th Amendment get passed in the United States.
That's right. The president himself doesn't have the power to just change this because he wants, but Congress went through it and did pass the 12th Amendment, making Aaron Burr the last vice president to be chosen by runner-up vote.
That's right. So the 12th Amendment, just to summarize, it's a big, long, wordy thing because that's how lawyers work and how politicians work. But it establishes the precedent that electors have to designate who is their presidential vote, who is their vice presidential vote, and there's no chance of the vice president overtaking the president. And so when you have tickets running together now, we select the Clinton-Kaine ticket or the Trump-Pence ticket. We don't have the chance of Mike Pence overtaking Donald Trump in the election cycle. They are now teamed up and appointed that way from the beginning. So we don't have this situation that we saw in the first few administrations.
Now Aaron Burr is only going to last for one term in this presidency as vice president.
That's right, because a number of things happened between the years of 1800 and 1804. notably a duel that we will get to on this podcast in a later episode. But you'll see that Aaron Burr becomes political baggage, and he isn't the person that's going to carry the North anymore. He's not going to help the Democratic-Republican cause. And so Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who fight with each other a lot since this election cycle didn't go the way Jefferson wanted it to go from the beginning, it didn't go the way Burr wanted it either, obviously. He would have probably really enjoyed that top seat as president. But you see that Aaron Burr doesn't even get to use the vice presidency as a stepping stone to the presidency. He's the first vice president in American history who did not use the vice presidency as a stepping stone. John Adams did it. Thomas Jefferson did it. Aaron Burr's the third vice president on the ticket, and he never gets to be president. And here you see, like you said, Thomas Jefferson drops Aaron Burr from the ticket. After presiding over getting the 12th Amendment passed, he drops Aaron Burr from the Republican ticket and puts former Governor George Clinton into the vice president's role for the Democratic-Republican Party. So that's another New Yorker who had fought in the Revolutionary War. We've mentioned him on this podcast a number of times before. Clinton from New York. It should be pretty familiar to a lot of people. And he is someone who can carry the New York state without being the political baggage that Aaron Burr had become.
And that takes us to the end of our lyrics here. Hey, Burr, when you see Hamilton, thank him for the endorsement, which he says with such a snide attitude.
Still snubbing the handshake.
Yeah, the hand is still there. And of course, the countenance of Burr has changed. You can see he's getting frustrated. He's upset. He's not smiling big anymore, but the hand's still there waiting, and it's snubbed.
And it sets the perfect tone for the beginning of this next song, where Aaron Burr is singing over these dark tones, and he says, how does Hamilton, singing through his teeth, singing through his smile, saying, how does Hamilton, an arrogant, immigrant, orphan, bastard, horse son, somehow endorse Thomas Jefferson? And he goes on and has that frustration, that anger, and now there is no more Mr. Nice Burr, no more Mr. Nice Vice President. We see that Aaron Burr is on a mission to challenge Alexander Hamilton, and he will not be satisfied until that duel is accepted. One of the things I appreciate about the way that this scene plays out is you see that the three Republicans are there in the front of the stage. You see the Northern Republican, Aaron Burr, who's been isolated and snubbed. You see the two other Republicans, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, standing next to each other, still teamed up, talking to each other about how they just defeated Aaron Burr. And I'm thinking through this, and we're talking about how this song is the snub to Aaron Burr, where Aaron Burr didn't get to step into the presidency, and instead Thomas Jefferson's turning his attention toward his friend James Madison, who will get to be the next president.
Right. And we're going to be covering more of the Jefferson presidency and probably the Madison presidency a little bit in future episodes. When the curtain closes, we're going to have our After Hamilton episodes. So keep an eye out for those.
Yeah, I'm so excited. We mentioned this at the end of the last episode, but we have a number of ideas that we are putting together that are in the pipeline for what we're doing once we've covered the final song for Hamilton the Musical. We're going to talk about some historical episodes called What Comes Next for Thomas Jefferson, What Comes Next for Aaron Burr. We're going to talk about the Burr conspiracy or the Burr treason, depending on how you want to brand that. We're going to talk about some of the history that comes after. We're also going to do some musical reviews for those of you who listen to us because of the Broadway hints. We're going to look at some fun musicals that are connected to this musical that you really need to understand if you want to get every single reference inside of it. So those are just two hints I'll give you for now. We have a couple other things in the pipeline, and we will not spoil all of them, but we will give you more details as they come up. And if you're interested in making sure that we can continue this podcast past the curtain call of Hamilton, an American Musical, then make sure you join us on Patreon, and you can become a supporter. Give us $1 a month or whatever amount you're willing to support per month to help our efforts going forward, to make sure that Vinton here with the Graphomania Podcast Network is able to keep the technology going, keep the work going, and support the cause that we have here to continue learning historically and supporting the Broadway efforts and going forward with what we have in mind. We're excited. We can't wait to partner with you and get more information in your hands about what's going on, because there's so much fun, and I can't wait to cover the Jefferson presidency.
That's right. And if you have any suggestions, hit us up, contact@graphocast.com, on Twitter @graphocast, Or you can leave comments on the website, graphocast.com. And like Robbie said, if you'd like to support us, check out patreon.com/graphocast and get yourself some extra exclusive goodies. And personally on Twitter, as always, I'm at Flesh Eater.
And I'm at Alpha Knight.
Until next week, signed your obedient servants, V.Bay.
R.Hurlocker.
Bayne. Bayne? Yeah, I think that works.
You're my bae.
What's up, Bay?
What's up, bae?
This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, graphocast.com. Follow us on Twitter at Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.